Hey, how's it going everyone? It's me, it's Jinsula. I hope you're having a good day and welcome to today's Pokemon Go video. Okay, so today we're going to be doing a tier list for every single legendary Pokemon that was released in Pokemon Go up until the month of July 2023. There's a bunch of Pokemon that are really good that are legendaries, but there's also a lot of Pokemon that you really do not need to care about. That's what I'm going to be going over in this video, so let's roll the intro and get right into it. Alright, let's dive right into it. So, there are a plethora of different legendaries of different types and of different abilities that exist in Pokemon Go. Some of them are really good for PvP, while others are good for raid battles, for you to collect other legendary Pokemon. I have to tell you that a bunch of these legendary Pokemon are extremely iconic, and there's a couple that people just do not necessarily care about. In my opinion, every single legendary that's in Pokemon Go is going to be useful in some way, but there's definitely going to be some standouts. The criteria for this tier list is pretty simple. Every single one of these Pokemon is going to be ranked based on their usefulness. And yeah, there's going to be some Pokemon that are going to be good for both PvP and raid battles, but there's going to be some that are exclusively good for PvP and some that are exclusively good for raid battles. I'm going to be explaining all of that as I go along, but in general, take this list as kind of like your guide for what Pokemon you should invest into and what Pokemon you could probably just treat as a Pokedex entry. Alright, so with that said, let's jump right into it. So, first of all, we're going to start with the legendary bird trio from the Kanto region. This includes Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. Now, among these three birds, I would say that Moltres is actually the most useful, but it's not necessarily going to be top tier in a lot of different areas. I'm going to slot it in the... I'm going to put it in the A slot because I actually think this Pokemon is incredible for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, it's a top tier flying type, and then of course, if you happen to have the shadow form of this Pokemon, you're going to deal a lot of raid damage as well. Now, when it comes to Articuno and Zapdos, I would consider them more as a C tier. Actually, I would probably put Zapdos more in the D tier, but the more I think about it, I think he fits best in the C tier. Now, for both of these Pokemon, they don't necessarily have that many uses in Pokemon Go. Like, Articuno can be considered a decent raid attacker, but considering that there's a lot of really good ice types out there, you really do not necessarily need Articuno, and that's kind of the hard truth. And the same can be said for Zapdos when it comes to electric types. Both of these Pokemon have some potential within the Go Battle League, but it's really going to be difficult to slot them into a team and actually find a lot of good success. I really feel like in the future, if they get some new moves, maybe they will be relevant, but as of right now, they're considered C tier Pokemon in my opinion. Next up, let's move on to Mewtwo, which is of course the absolute most iconic legendary probably in this entire list. Of course, Mewtwo comes in two varieties, one of which is actually incredibly rare. That one is, of course, Armored Mewtwo. And this Pokemon, I'm actually also going to include in the C. Actually, I'm going to put him in the B tier because this Pokemon is actually really good for PvP in some of the more difficult leagues, like the Ultra League. It's not necessarily going to be that common in the Ultra League or Master League, but it's actually pretty good if you happen to have one. Now, of course, there's regular Mewtwo, and this one is probably the most iconic legendary out of this entire list. And it's also one of the most popular, if not the most popular legendary in the game. I'm actually going to put this in the S tier, and it's probably going to be pretty lonely up there for a little while, and it's for good reason, because Mewtwo is by far the quintessential legendary Pokemon. It is absolutely the best on this list. Like, it doesn't matter if it's PvP or raid battles, like this Pokemon is going to be extremely useful. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Alright, next let's move on to the Eon Trio. I think that's what they're called. The legendary beasts, the legendary dogs, that's what they are. So there's Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. Now, when it comes to these three, I would say that Raikou is the most useful, but it's not necessarily going to be the top tier when it comes to electric types. So I'm going to put it in the B tier, mainly because there's going to be some instances where you will need to use Raikou, but in general, it's not necessarily going to be the absolute best. It does have a shadow form, and that form is actually really good for raid battles, but still, there's a lot of really good electric types, so there's just a lot of competition there when it comes to raid damage. Next up, we got Entei, which by all counts, is a really good fire type. It has extremely high TDO, but with the release of a lot of other legendaries and fire types, like, I would consider Entei as more of a C tier Pokemon. Like, there's other Pokemon that do what Entei does, but a lot better. Like, a lot better. And yeah, it even gets outclassed by Moltres, which should already tell you that Entei is not necessarily going to be that useful. And then, of course, we have Suicune, which is infamously one of the most forgettable Pokemon in Pokemon GO. This one is actually going to be our first trash tier legendary. It's really got no uses in Pokemon GO. Like, maybe there's a specialty cup that will eventually happen where Suicune will be useful, but the stats and moves are just so trash that there's just no reason for you to ever invest into this Pokemon. Alright, now let's move on to Lugia, which, in my opinion, is going to belong somewhere up here because of just how useful it is in a lot of different aspects of Pokemon GO. In my opinion, it's going to be an A tier Pokemon. It is actually the absolute best of the best when it comes to the Open Master League, and if you happen to have yourself a really good one, like, you might deal a good amount of raid damage as well. It's could be used as either a flying type or a psychic type raid damage dealer, and it does that job really well. So yeah, it's an A tier Pokemon. Next, let's move on to Ho-Oh, which actually got some sizable improvements over the past couple of years, and that's because of some new moves. I'm actually going to put this Pokemon in the B tier, because again, it's a really solid Master League pick, and it's also pretty decent for raid damage. Although, I would say that when it comes to raid damage, it's going to fall behind a lot of fire types and flying types that are already out there, but it's still pretty decent if you happen to have yourself a good one. Alright, moving on to the Hoenn region, which, if you did not know, has some of the most legendaries out of all of the generations. Starting off, we have the Reggie Trio, the classic trio Pokemon that a lot of players use for PvP, primarily. The first of these is, of course, Regirock, which I'm actually going to slot in the B tier because Regirock is really good for the Ultra League. It's actually considered probably one of the most underrated picks in the Ultra League. It's incredible in terms of its damage, and it does have a really good moveset. And you know, it could be used as a rock type attacker for raids if you do not have some good rock types, but in general, it's going to be really good for PvP, even considered an upper tier. And then we get to Regice, which, when it comes to ice types, it's going to fall behind even non-legendaries. And yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't have good enough stats and moves to make it viable in PvP, but it's not necessarily going to be useless. So I'm going to slot it in the D tier. It's somewhat useful when it comes to ice types, but it's also not that useful as well. So yeah, it's perfect for the D tier. Now, let's move on to Registeel, which, if you've ever done any kind of PvP in either the Great League or Ultra League, you would know how infamous this Pokemon is. It's probably one of the best Steel-type Pokemon out there when it comes to PvP, just behind Pokemon like Metagross when it comes to the Master League and Ultra League. Actually, when it comes to Registeel, you'll never see it in the Master League unless you're going up against a bunch of noobs, but with the Ultra League and with the Great League, it's probably one of the most top-tier Pokemon for the last several seasons. And yeah, because of that reason, I'm going to put it in the A tier slot, because getting yourself a good Registeel is actually pretty clutch when it comes to PvP. It's incredibly reliable, and it has very few counters. So yeah, A tier Pokemon specifically because of PvP. Alright, next let's move on to Latios and Latias. I'm actually going to start with Latios, and I'm actually going to slot it in the A slot. Now, I know this is going to be a little controversial because Latios is definitely outclassed by a lot of other Pokemon, but it's actually pretty useful. Like, I've actually found myself using a Latios more often than not. It's actually an incredibly good raid attacker in a lot of different circumstances, and it also has a Mega Evolution, which is actually something you should not ignore. So, as a raid attacker, I would consider it an A tier Pokemon, but actually, because it doesn't necessarily have any PvP relevance, maybe it's more deserving of B tier slot, but I kind of want to keep it in the A tier slot for now, just because I really feel like this Pokemon is underrated. Next up, we have Latias, which actually lives up to her reputation. It's more of a D slot Pokemon. Now, this Pokemon is powerful, don't get me wrong, but it definitely gets outclassed by a lot of other Pokemon. And yeah, even though it does have a Mega Evolution, you will almost always prefer Latios. That's basically the hard reality with that. Alright, next let's move on to probably the 3 most powerful legendary Pokemon when it comes to a trio, and that is of course the Weather Trio, which consists of Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza. Now, all 3 of these Pokemon can be seen as either an A tier or an S tier. In my opinion, all 3 of them are S tier. Without question, these 3 Pokemon are some of the most powerful legendaries that you can have in your collection, and that's not hyperbole. All 3 of them have some sort of Mega Evolution or Primal Evolution of some kind, and those are extremely powerful, typically the best of their types. Rayquaza's Mega Evolution is of course coming at the end of the summer with Go Fest, and that Pokemon is definitely going to make a huge impact once it arrives. And when it comes to Groudon and Kyogre, we got their primal reversions near the beginning of the year with the Hoenn Go Tour event, and yeah, they've made certain aspects of Pokemon Go incredibly easy. Kyogre is by far one of the best water-type Pokemon in the game, especially its primal reversion form, and Groudon, even if it's not primal reverted, it's one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful ground type in the game. Alright, now let's move on to the Sinnoh Pokemon, which includes the Lake Trio, the Reality Quad Trio, I don't know what they're actually called, and then a whole bunch of various other Pokemon. Actually, this is probably the largest set of legendary Pokemon that you can come across. So let's start off with the Lake Trio. We got Uxie. I'm gonna consider this an obvious trash Pokemon. It's not necessarily that good in any aspect of Pokemon Go. Like, I've seen it maybe once in the Great League, and that was the easiest win that I've ever experienced. Like, Uxie is one of the most useless Pokemon in the game, and I have to say it's unfortunately going to fall into the trash tier. Next up, we got Mesprit, which actually is going to also be a trash tier Pokemon for a lot of the same reasons as Uxie. It's just unfortunate because this Pokemon does look really cool. I like the kind of dreadlock style of it, but yeah, unfortunately there's just no gameplay reason to ever invest into either of these 2 Lake Trio Pokemon. However, when it comes to Azelf, there is some potential with this Pokemon. If you do not have really good psychic types, like if you do not have yourself an Alakazam or a Mewtwo or anything like that, Azelf is actually a pretty decent psychic type raid attacker. So I'm going to slot it in the C tier. It's unfortunately going to have no PvP presence, but it can be a decent B tier like psychic type raid attacker. So yeah, consider it a C tier Pokemon. Alright, next let's move on to Dialga, which is infamously one of the best Master League Pokemon in the game, and it's remained that way for a long time. This one is going to be a B tier. Now, the reason why I have it as a B tier is of course because it's almost exclusively good for just one league, and that is the Master League. Outside of that, it's really going to struggle when it comes to raid damage or when it comes to just about any other form of gameplay, mainly because the movesets are extremely lackluster. Like, it comes with Draco Meteor, which is probably one of the most, clunkiest like charge attacks in the game, and yeah, it deals a lot of damage, but it's not necessarily something you're going to use in raid battles. So unfortunately, Dialga is more of a B slot Pokemon. It's pretty good, but it's not great. Like, that's pretty much all it's going to come down to. Palkia is going to be a C tier Pokemon. Again, it's a really good Pokemon and it can be useful in a lot of different ways, but unfortunately it's more of a niche Pokemon. It's going to be in the Master League every so often, but it's going to get outclassed even there. And yeah, as a raid attacker, it's mainly only going to fulfill like raid damage that you really do not have. Like, if for water types and dragon types, there's definitely going to be better options out there, but if you're lacking in those better options, then Palkia might fit in. Now, when it comes to Giratina, it obviously comes with 2 forms. I'm going to put both of these in the... Actually, I'm going to put I think this is the altered form. I'm going to put the altered form in the B tier, and then the origin form in the A tier. Origin form Giratina is actually one of the best ghost type Pokemon in the game, and yeah, it's really powerful, and it can actually be really good in PvP as well. Like, you won't see it in the Great League or the Ultra League, but in terms of the Master League, it can be incredible and give you a lot of success. So I'm actually going to keep it in the A tier. I think that's a good slot for it. Now, of course, with Giratina altered form or the origin form, I actually don't know which one's which. I always get confused by that. I think this is the origin form and this is the altered form. So yeah, with the altered form, it's kind of a niche pick as well. It's mainly good for the Ultra League. It's kind of like Dialga. Like, you won't necessarily use it for any other aspect of Pokemon Go, but in terms of the Ultra League, it fits in as kind of a niche pick. So yeah, it's going to be a B tier Pokemon. That's just the way it is. Next, let's move on to Heatran, which is, I think it's going to be a C tier Pokemon. It's actually really strong for raids, but not necessarily the best. And, you know, when it comes to PvP, again, it's kind of a niche pick with the Master League. But even then, there's so many counters to Heatran in the Master League that you really do not want to use it. So, unfortunately, it's going to be a C tier Pokemon. It can be useful in some cases, but in general, it's not necessarily going to be one you will want to bank on. Next up, let's move on to Regigigas, which I guess in terms of the lore is supposed to be the strongest among the Regis, but in Pokemon Go, it is actually a trash tier Pokemon. Yeah, this Pokemon has no uses in Pokemon Go. Unfortunately, it's the only normal type legendary Pokemon currently in existence. And yeah, unfortunately that means it's not going to have any kind of type advantages. It's going to be weak against fighting types. And there really is no place for this Pokemon. Like, it's mainly there as a trophy. Next, let's move on to Cresselia. Now, this Pokemon is infamously really good for the Go Battle League as well. It's really good for the Great League as well as the Ultra League, and because of that, I'm actually going to slot it in the B tier. Yeah, it may not be good enough to be up here, like, it's not at Registeel levels of usefulness, but it's definitely pretty good, and it's definitely a B tier Pokemon, in my opinion. It's not necessarily going to be, like, good enough to be an A tier Pokemon, like it has no raid significance at all, but in terms of its Great League and Ultra League uses, that's going to give it that B tier slot. Next, let's move on to the Swords of Justice, which include these three Pokemon, and of course Caldeo, which is actually a mythical Pokemon, so that's why it's not on this list. This first is Cobalion, which, in my opinion, is going to be a solid C tier Pokemon. This Pokemon is pretty good for PvP, but outside of that, you really won't find any uses for it. And then, of course, when it comes to Virizion, very same thing. Like, actually, these two Pokemon pretty much go hand in hand. They're niche uses for the Ultra League and pretty much nowhere else. Now, when it comes to Terrakion, however, this one is actually the best fighting type Pokemon in the game right now. That's not a Mega or a non-Shadow. And yeah, it's incredibly useful. It has high damage as well as high TDO. That's something you do not often see when it comes to any Pokemon in Pokemon Go. Therefore, I would actually put it as an A tier Pokemon because this Pokemon is going to be incredible, and one of the things that I use it for the most is actually PvE content that's not raids, like Team Go Rocket battles and gym battles. It's probably the most useful there. Unfortunately, absolutely zero PvP presence. It's very much kind of a wasted opportunity. Like, for example, Machamp. It's one of the most used Pokemon in PvP. It's actually a lot weaker than Terrakion, but because of that rock typing, Terrakion is actually a liability. So yeah, it's going to be an A tier Pokemon, extremely useful in pretty much every aspect of Pokemon Go, just outside of PvP. So yeah. Next, let's move on to the, I forgot what they're called, the Forces of Nature. Yeah, so they actually come in a set, but they also come in two forms. So first of these is going to be, I believe this is Tornadus. So this is the flying type Force of Nature. It's really good, but unfortunately not good enough to be useful. It's a D tier Pokemon. It's basically kind of like a nerfed down version of your best flying type. It's pretty good in terms of like having high TDO, but when it comes to flying types, there's just so many better options out there. The same kind of goes for the Tarian form, which, you know, it does have some potential. Like, maybe I could put it in the C tier slot, but it's actually still going to be D tier, just because when it comes to like these two Pokemon, for example, they're going to be much better flying types compared to these two Pokemon. So yeah. Next, let's move on to Thundurus. Once again, they're both going to kind of fall in here. Actually, the Tarian form does enough damage where it could slot in here. Like, it's basically kind of the same story. Like, there's so many better electric types out there that you really do not have any uses for either of these Pokemon. And then, of course, there's Landorus, which is actually the ground type version. The, whatever this version is called, the incarnate form, is going to be in the D tier slot. But when it comes to the Tarian form, I would actually put it in the A tier slot. Now, why do I do that? Well, first and foremost, it's one of the top ground type attackers in the game, just behind Groudon and a bunch of other ground types. But yeah, it's incredible when it comes to ground type raid damage, and you really should not ignore it. And then of course, when it comes to PvP, I've actually seen it pretty much used in the Master League. It's actually pretty good. It's kind of a much cheaper, much more accessible alternative to Groudon. So, you know, if you want yourself a really solid Pokemon that will kind of throw off your opponents, Terran Form Landorus is definitely the one. Alright, next let's move on to Zekrom and Reshiram. These two Pokemon are incredibly powerful. I would actually consider them the best of their type. When it comes to Reshiram, it's definitely an A-tier Pokemon. It's incredibly strong. Like, it has a lot of fire type damage. You really can't go wrong using this Pokemon, and the dragon typing actually complements it really well. Considering that the counters to fire types are pretty common, the dragon typing is there to kind of counteract some of those counters. So yeah, that's something you should keep in mind. Zekrom is in the same boat. It's probably the best non-shadow, non-mega electric type that's currently in the game, unless you're counting just pure DPS, in which case Xurkitree is definitely going to be better, but in general, Zekrom is incredibly useful. And yes, it does have some uses in the Master League as well. And then of course we got Kyurem, which I'm actually going to consider a D-tier Pokemon. Unfortunately, it just gets outclassed in just about every way. Like, yes, it has some really good uses in the Master League. Actually, now that I think about it, I think it's upper tier in the Master League. So maybe I'll just move it up to the C tier, actually. That probably is a better fit for it. But yeah, it's a really strong Pokemon. It's just unfortunately outclassed by pretty much every other Dragon type and Ice type that's out there. The one thing that it does have going for it is, of course, that unique type combination of Dragon and Ice. So that's something that it can hang its hat on. So yeah. Next up, let's talk about Xerneas. This is an iconic Pokemon when it comes to the main series games, but unfortunately when it comes to Pokemon GO, it does lack a lot of that attack prowess in PvP. It's unfortunately going to be a D-tier Pokemon. It's really not that useful. Like, I know a lot of people use it as like fairy type raid damage or as some sort of interesting pocket pick in the Master League, but yeah, there's just so many Pokemon that, like, some of them we'll get into later that are just so much better than Xerneas and everything that you would use it for, that it's going to be a D-tier Pokemon, unfortunately. Next up, there's Yveltal, which is actually going to be the opposite. There's actually some uses for this Pokemon. On top of it being a pretty decent Dark-type raid attacker, it's also got some uses in PvP as well, Master League in particular. So yeah, B-tier is a good spot for that. Next up, let's move on to the Tapu Pokemon. I don't necessarily know what they're actually called. The Island Guardians is, I think, what they're called. But first, we got Tapu Bulu, or Tapu, the electric one. This one's going to be a D-tier slot Pokemon, unfortunately. Actually, maybe it could be a trash tier Pokemon, but it's still useful in some way. It's kind of like a weak version of Raikou and Zapdos. Like, there's so many electric types that are better than this Pokemon. It's just really unfortunate because I do think it's pretty cool. Same thing goes for Tapu. I think this is Lele. Tapu Lele. Yeah, it's not necessarily one of the best out there, but it's not the worst. That's basically all I can say about that. Tapu Bulu, this one's an interesting one. I would consider this a B-tier Pokemon because, yeah, it's one of the top grass-type Pokemon out there. And that's pretty important because there's not many options when it comes to grass-type raid attackers. So Tapu Bulu is definitely going to be up there on this list. In terms of non-shadows and non-megas, it's only going to get outclassed by just one Pokemon, and that is, of course, the Ultra Beast Kartana. By the way, the Ultra Beast I didn't include in this video. I'm pretty sure you figured it out by now, but if I were to include the Ultra Beasts, then maybe this would fall behind a little bit, but because Kartana is not in this list, and we're only talking about legendaries being compared to each other, yeah, I would say it's a B-tier Pokemon. It's definitely the most useful out of every one of the Tapu Pokemon, so yeah. Next up, we got Tapu Fini, which is going to be a C-tier Pokemon. It's pretty good, like, it has some niche uses in the Ultra League, but in general, that's pretty much all that's going to be, and it's not even ranked that high. It's basically kind of like a beefed up version of Azumarill, but it doesn't have the same kind of moveset that Azumarill has, so yeah, it's a C-tier Pokemon. I really do not think you're ever going to use this Pokemon outside of the Ultra League, even at that. Next up, we got Cosmog, which is, of course, going to be a trash tier legendary. Like, it's meant to be there to be evolved into the either Solgaleo or Lunala, so yeah, unfortunately, trash tier Pokemon, no reason to use this. Maybe someday in the Go Battle League, there'll be some specialty cup that will actually make this relevant, but yeah, as of right now, it's just Evolution Father. It's it's just meant to be there just for the sake of being evolved into Solgaleo or Lunala. Same goes for Cosmo M, which is obviously the second stage of that evolution in line. Yeah, there's no reason to ever power this up, you know? There's just no reason to. Now, let's move on to the duo that evolves from Cosmo M. First, Solgaleo. This Pokemon is, right now, I would consider a C tier Pokemon. Unfortunately, I really haven't figured out how to use this Pokemon. Like, it's supposed to be good for the Go Battle League, but for one, I never come across Solgaleo, and two, I just haven't figured out, like, where it could slot in. So, yeah, unfortunately, for me, it's going to be a C tier Pokemon. Alright, next, we got Lunala. Same deal. I really do not know where you could use this Pokemon. It's, I guess really good, but we haven't really figured out, like, how good it can be. Maybe with the addition of a new move sometime in the future, it could actually be useful, but, you know, yeah, I really don't know where to put this Pokemon. Maybe, like, both of these belong here for right now. Like, I feel like that's more appropriate, because when it comes to, like, comparing it to, like, some of these Pokemon, like, they're actually pretty good in some leagues. Actually, I might need to rearrange some of this right now that I'm looking at it. It just kind of seems out of place. Actually, no, I'm gonna keep it. I think it looks fine. But yeah, I think when it comes to these two Pokemon, their potential hasn't been met yet. Like, maybe in the future they'll get better moves that will make them that much stronger, but as of right now, I would consider them D tier Pokemon. They're just kind of like in the beginning stages of their usefulness, so yeah, that's basically where I'm gonna slot them. Now, let's move on to these two. I'm gonna start with Zamazenta. It's a trash tier Pokemon. Let's be real here. It's not good in any aspect of Pokemon Go right now. Like, some people have made the case for it being a good PvP Pokemon, but yeah, there's just so many better fighting types out there, and there's just so many better, like, whatever other type it has. I don't even know. Like, it's just not good, in my opinion. Like, there's just no uses for that. But on the other hand, Zacian, like, that's going to be more of a B tier Pokemon. Oh, not an A tier. It's a B tier Pokemon. It's really good for the Master League. Just like with a lot of these other Pokemon, like, it's kind of niche. Like, it's basically one of the best Ultra League or Master League Pokemon, but that's pretty much it. That's the only time you ever use it. Alright, now we're approaching the final Pokemon on this list, and yeah, wow, there's just so many Pokemon that are legendary, but when it comes to Regieleki, it's going to be a C tier Pokemon. Unfortunately, there's just no place for Regieleki in Pokemon Go. Like, the stats are abysmal for PvP, they're not good enough for PvE, and yeah, it basically suffers a lot of the same problems that Zapdos has, where there's just a lot of better options out there. Same goes for Regidrago, and in fact for Regidrago, I would actually put it even lower than Regieleki. Like, because there's such a plethora of dragon types, like, pretty much a bunch of these could be used as a dragon type attacker, and they're going to do a lot better than Regidrago. So yeah, that is a D tier legendary, unfortunately. Alright, finally we made it to the last couple of Pokemon, the last set of Pokemon, and it's going to be the Galarian legendary birds. We're going back to Kanto, but really we're going to Galar, and yeah, these three Pokemon are iconic for just having a fresh new flavor to some iconic old Pokemon, and I really do dig that. First and foremost, there's Articuno. Unfortunately, nowhere in the game is this Pokemon going to be useful, at least for right now. I do think that not enough players have either of these three Pokemon, so not a lot of uses have been tested, but when it comes to just pure stats and moves, it's unfortunately not useful at all. And then next up we have Galarian Zapdos, which, yeah, unfortunately it does kind of fall into the same pitfalls, but I would actually consider it more of a C tier because it does have some niche uses when it comes to specialty cups and even the Great or Ultra League, so I'm not going to discount it for now. And then of course we have Galarian Moltres, which I'm unfortunately going to consider it a D tier. And the reason for that is because it's kind of a nerfed down version of this guy, Yveltal. Like, if you have yourself a Yveltal, you do not need to power up Galarian Moltres. It's basically the downgraded version of Yveltal. It's got the same types, it's got most of the same moves, but the stats definitely prefer Yveltal. So yeah, fortunately, no matter how iconic these three Pokemon are, they are, unfortunately, both C and D tier Pokemon. And yeah, I think this list is pretty solid. I think everything seems to make sense. You know, like some would argue that Entei belongs up here, but I really do not think he does. Palkia, same story. These two Pokemon are really strong for the Ultra League, but I just don't think enough players use them, and there are a lot of counters against them. Yeah, I think this is a solid list, and I think it makes sense. The one thing I will change, and it was just nagging me the whole time as I was making this tier list, I'm gonna move Latios down to here, because yeah, just forgetting about the fact that Mega Rayquaza is coming to Rays, that's definitely going to bump down Latios quite a lot, because the one thing that Latios has had going for it this whole entire time is the fact that it has a Mega Evolution. But yeah, even that's going to be rendered null once Mega Rayquaza comes out. But yeah, there you have it. This is my tier list for every single legendary that was ever released in Pokemon Go. Thank you for sticking it with me with this video. I know it was a long one, but it was definitely a lot of fun. Like, I'm actually enjoying making these tier videos. Like, it makes me think a lot harder about some of the nitty-gritty parts of Pokemon Go. Like, some of the things I don't really think about. And yeah, looking at this list actually makes me think, wow, there's been so many legendaries that have been released in Pokemon Go up until this point, and it's pretty wild. Like, you know, I remember a time where it was just the 3 legendary birds and Mewtwo, and that was just all the hype. Like, yeah, those 3 plus Lugia was all you needed to generate a whole bunch of hype. But nowadays, I can understand why certain legendaries haven't been seen in a while, because Niantic has to cycle through all of these. Yeah, in any case, yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Definitely share your thoughts regarding this tier list. I totally understand that not a lot of players out there are going to fully agree with me when it comes to this list. So definitely share what you would have done when it comes to this tier list down below in the comments, and let's have a great discussion. And if you ended up enjoying this video, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if it's your first time here. And don't forget that little bell so you can stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. And I want to give a quick shout out to my patrons on Patreon. If you make this channel content possible, if you want to support my channel in any way, big or small, then do consider checking out the links in the description below. For all my patrons, they get a permanent spot on my in-game friends list. So if you want to interact with me in some way within Pokemon Go, like with remote raids, then do consider becoming a patron on my Patreon. And yeah, that's going to be it. I'm Count Jinsula. Be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all later.